Okay, so here is the video for Thursday. We are talking about neural activation theory. And remember, I said this is kind of similar to what we talked about yesterday with the brain stimulation. So, as we think about neural activation theory, this theory is proposing that REM sleep, so deep sleep, triggers neural activity that evokes random memories, which our sleeping brain then weaves into stories. So, if you think about this, and we haven't talked about processing yet, but we will get there. Um, the idea is that when we're sleeping deeply, something triggers our brain, and that brings up all of these random memories. Our brain takes that random information and makes it into one coherent, logical story. Okay. So, in another sense, dreams are our brain's attempt to make sense of random neural activity because we know from different scans and different studies that our brains are very active. They're still active while we're sleeping. This theory would suggest that part of the way that our brain deals with the neural activity that comes up is it makes it a story, which then turns into your dream. Okay, so let's talk about the science behind that. So, thinking about PET scans, okay, they've done PET scans of people, and what we've seen is that there's increased activity in our limbic system, which is where our emotion related section of our brain is. Okay, we didn't really get to do brain parts before we left, but you can see this picture over to the right that shows the limbic system. So, we have the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And I think we've talked about the hippocampus as our memory center and then amygdala as our emotion center. But we also have homeostasis with hypothalamus. Remember, that's keeping our body level, keeping um, our blood pressure normal, keeping us breathing. And then we have the thalamus, which is relaying information. So that's like an information highway for our brain. So those four parts we've seen are involved in REM sleep. Okay. These are the parts of our brain that process visual images. Now, there is a difference between receiving raw information. So as you look right now, you are receiving information through your eyes. You're seeing this PowerPoint in this video. That is different than processing the visual images. Okay. So once the image comes in, that's the first step. Then the actual process, that integration, remember Space Command, that part is very different than the reception. And so we know that this part of our brain is processing the visual images. So even though while we're sleeping, we're not seeing anything, the parts of our brain that process visual images are still active. We also see that parts of our brain that are responsible for logical thinking, like our frontal lobe, they're idle, they're sleep, or they're shut off during REM sleep. Okay, so they're not as active as our emotional memory center is. And if you think about it, the limbic system is just so full of emotion. So when you pair emotion with our brain's visual bursts, you get a dream, right? That makes a lot of sense in this theory. And we've also seen that damaging the limbic system or our visual centers in our brain can actually impair dreaming. So we know there's a direct connection between the limbic system, visual processing, and dreaming. Okay. So we see a biological connection between these parts of our brain and this system, which really enhances, I think, the argument that this theory is making. The criticism is that because your individual brain is making these stories, right? So that tells us something unique about you as the dreamer, right? So that really pushes away from the argument that this is just kind of random, disconnected neural activity coming up and our brain sorts it. More so that there's a thought, there's a criticism that there's some meaning to this. And all these criticisms, these are not coming from me. These are different psychologists and people who have researched this who've said, yeah, there's some flaws in this system. So that is our fourth theory of dreaming, and tomorrow we'll end with our last theory of dreaming.